My granddaughter was the one who saved me. I keep coming back to that. Of all the people in my life, my colleagues of 30 years, my neighbors, my old friends from the army, it was a 22-year-old girl with paint-stained fingers and a second-hand laptop who saw what was happening before I did. And she didn't say a word until the moment it mattered most. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Walter. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer for the county of Maricopa, Arizona. Roads, drainage systems, the kind of infrastructure work that nobody thinks about until something goes wrong. I retired 4 years ago with a decent pension, a paid-off house in Chandler, and the kind of quiet life I thought I'd earned. I coached Little League for 12 years. I make my own chili. I go to the same diner on Route 202 every Saturday morning and order the same thing, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, and Earl behind the counter has it started before I even sit down. I am not an exciting man. I know that. My late wife, Carol, used to tease me about it. She'd say, "Walter, you are the most reliably boring man I have ever loved." And she meant it as a compliment. We were married 38 years before she passed. Pancreatic cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. The worst 14 months of my life, and also somehow the most important, because I learned what it means to sit with someone in the dark and just be present, to not flinch, to stay. After she died, I didn't expect anything else. I was 63. I had my routines, my pension, my Saturday eggs. I had my daughter, Renee, who lives 20 minutes away in Mesa with her husband and 2 kids. I had my granddaughter, Sophie, Renee's daughter from her first marriage, who was finishing up art school at ASU and coming over on Sundays to raid my refrigerator. I thought that was my life now, and I was okay with it. Then I met Diane. She was introduced to me at a retirement party for a friend from the county office. She was 61, recently divorced, and she laughed at something I said about drainage permits. Actually laughed, like it was funny, which it wasn't, and I thought, well, there's something. We dated for 14 months. Slow at first, then less slow. She was warm and attentive, and she made pot roast on Sundays that was genuinely the best I'd ever had, including my mother's, which I would never say out loud. She had a way of touching my arm when I was talking, this light pressure just above the elbow, that made me feel like whatever I was saying mattered. I know how that sounds. I was a lonely old man who missed being touched. Maybe that's all it was. But I want to be fair to myself, too. I wasn't naive. I'd lived 67 years. I'd bury the wife. I knew what grief does to judgment, and I thought I'd been careful. I hadn't been careful enough. Diane had a son named Marcus. He was 38, worked in real estate development, the kind that means he drove a very nice truck and used the word portfolio a lot and was always in the middle of something that was about to be huge. He had good teeth and a firm handshake and called me Walt the first time we met, which nobody calls me, but I let it go. He was charming in that way that certain people are charming, where afterward you can't quite remember what he said, only that you felt good while he was saying it. Marcus came to the house 3 times in the first 6 months I was with Diane, just stopping by, just checking in. The 3rd time he walked through my living room looking at things, my bookshelves, the photos, the view from the back window, with this expression I couldn't name then. I can name it now. He was appraising. He asked me once, casually, like it just occurred to him, whether I'd ever thought about investment property, whether my financial advisor had talked to me about diversifying out of fixed income. I told him I wasn't really interested in that kind of thing. He nodded and changed the subject and brought me a very nice bottle of whiskey the next time he came over. Diane never pushed. That's the thing I want to be clear about, because it matters. She never said anything directly about money. She just created space. She started staying over more often. She mentioned how much she loved the neighborhood, how different it felt from her apartment. She started leaving things at my house. Her coffee mug, a cardigan, a small, succulent plant she said she couldn't get to thrive at her place. 6 months ago, she asked if I had a will. She framed it as concern. She said she'd been thinking about her own estate planning, reading about it, and had I updated mine since Carol passed? Because apparently that was something couples in their situation should think about together. She said, our situation, with this gentle emphasis, like we were a unit, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I told her Carol and I had done our wills years ago. Everything was set up to go to Renee, with a trust provision for Sophie. She nodded thoughtfully and said that made sense. And then she mentioned that she'd been working with a financial planner, a friend of Marcus's, actually very well regarded, and maybe we could all sit down together sometime, just to make sure everything was optimized. I said sure. I was agreeable. I am, by nature, an agreeable man. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Sophie had already seen something. She told me later that it started small. She'd stopped by unannounced one afternoon to drop off a birthday card. My birthday was that week, and Diane hadn't heard her come into the back. Sophie heard voices in my home office and stopped in the hallway. She told me she wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She just heard her name and she stopped. Marcus was on the phone. Diane was with him. And what Sophie heard, standing very still in my hallway with a birthday card in her hand, was Marcus saying something about the Arizona probate process, and Diane responding, and then Marcus saying that they needed to move before I updated anything. Sophie stayed in that hallway for 4 minutes. She counted later. She didn't go in. She left through the back door without being heard, and she went home, and she sat with what she'd heard for 3 days before she did anything about it. She didn't come to me. I want to explain why that matters. She didn't come to me because she was afraid I wouldn't believe her. Because I was happy with Diane, visibly happy, and Sophie loved me enough to know that taking that away from me on the basis of a half-heard phone call could break something between us that might not heal. She was 22 years old, and she was thinking about all of that. About me, about us. That's who she is. Instead, she called her mother. Renee called her own attorney, a woman she'd worked with on her second mortgage refinance, sharp and direct and not the kind of person who wastes time. The attorney told Renee that what Sophie described, while not yet illegal, was consistent with a pattern she'd seen before. Older widower, recent relationship, financially comfortable, but not extraordinarily wealthy. The scheme, when it ran, usually involved either a change to a will or a quit marriage, sometimes both. The goal was access to the estate. My estate, in practical terms, the house in Chandler, currently appraised at $480,000. My pension and 401k, which together were solid but not dramatic. A small investment account Carol and I had built up over decades, just under $200,000. Not life-changing money for most people. Apparently enough to be worth the effort. Renee didn't call me either. I know some people reading this will think, why didn't they just tell him? I've asked myself that. The answer is that they knew me. They knew I would confront Diane directly, immediately, and that Diane and Marcus would deny everything and disappear, and nothing would come of it, and I would be left angry and humiliated and alone, or worse. I wouldn't fully believe it, and I'd stay, and eventually something would shift in my paperwork that I wouldn't even notice. So Renee called the attorney. The attorney made some calls, and they started building something. I found out about all of it on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Sophie asked me to lunch, which wasn't unusual. We went to the Mexican place on Dobson that she likes, and she ordered her usual shrimp tacos, no sour cream, and she waited until we were most of the way through the meal before she said, "Grandpa, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I put down my fork. She told me everything, the whole way. The phone call she'd heard, what she told her mom, what the attorney had found. She didn't rush it. She laid it out in order, which I later realized she'd practiced. Because she knew me well enough to know I needed sequence and logic, not just emotion. The attorney had found that Marcus had 2 prior complaints filed against him with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, both involving elderly clients, both involving financial arrangements that had been quietly settled. He'd had his license suspended once and reinstated. None of this was on the first page of any Google search, which I verified later. You had to know to look. Diane had been married twice before her recent divorce. The first husband I already knew about. The second husband, who she had never mentioned, not once, had died 18 months before I met her, leaving her his house, which she'd sold within a year. The meeting with Marcus's financial planner friend had been requested twice by Diane through text, according to records Sophie's attorney had advised could be relevant. The planner had no fiduciary obligation to me. He was Marcus's contact. Any recommendations he made would be in Marcus's interest. Sophie pulled out her phone and played me an audio recording. She had gone back to the house alone 2 weeks after the hallway incident. She'd come over while Diane was there, behaved completely normally, made tea, talked about her thesis project, and before she left, she'd placed her phone recording in the gap between the bookshelf and the wall in my home office, hidden behind a copy of an old Norman MacLean paperback I hadn't moved in years. She'd come back the next day when she knew I'd be at my Saturday diner, and Diane would have the house to herself, and she'd retrieved it. The recording was 47 minutes long. Sophie had time-stamped the relevant parts. At minute 11, Diane called Marcus. At minute 14, Marcus said that we needed to think about timing, because, and I'm paraphrasing the part that hit me hardest, he's agreeable, but he's not stupid. And if he talks to his daughter's lawyer before we get a signature, we lose the whole thing. There it was. He's agreeable, that word. My whole life I'd thought of agreeableness as a kind of virtue, keeping the peace, not making things difficult, going along because, why not? And someone had seen it, sized it up, and calculated that it made me useful. Sophie was watching me. She'd stopped the recording and she was watching me the way you watch someone when you're not sure if they're going to cry or stand up or just go very quiet. I went very quiet. I've spent a lot of years learning the difference between a reaction and a response. A reaction is what happens in your chest first, hot and immediate. A response is what you do after you've let that settle. I sat there in that Mexican restaurant on Dobson Road, and I felt the reaction move through me. The anger, the embarrassment, the particular humiliation of being a man who prides himself on good judgment and finding out how wrong he'd been. And then I let it go, still. I looked at my granddaughter, who had carried this by herself for weeks, because she loved me. I said, "Okay, what do we do next?" We did not confront Diane. That was the first decision. Renee's attorney had been clear. Don't tip them off. Don't deviate. Let them think everything is normal while we move carefully. What we moved carefully was my financial exposure. Within 2 weeks, with the attorney's guidance, I transferred the investment account into a trust naming Renee and Sophie as co-trustees, with the stipulation that any changes required both signatures plus a 30-day waiting period. This is legal, standard, and in Arizona, very difficult to contest. The attorney reviewed my existing will, and we updated it, clearly, with documentation and witnesses. The house was already in my name alone. It stayed that way. I also called the Arizona Attorney General's Consumer Protection Line. I won't pretend that was easy. I'm a private person, but the attorney told me that Marcus's pattern, the prior complaints, the specific targeting of recently widowed older homeowners, the use of an unlicensed financial arranger was something the AG's office had been building a file on. My documentation, including Sophie's recording and Diane's texts, would be a contribution to something larger than my own situation. I continued to see Diane during all of this. I continued to be agreeable. I brought her coffee at the right temperature and asked about her garden and listened to her stories about her book club. I smiled at the right moments. I was pleasant in the way I had always been pleasant, and I watched her, now with completely different eyes. There's something clarifying about knowing. I won't say it didn't hurt. It did, in a dull and thorough way, the way cold hurts more than pain. But it also made things very simple. I knew exactly who was in the room with me, and she did not know that I knew, and that imbalance, for the first time in this entire situation, was in my favor. The meeting with Marcus's financial planner friend was scheduled for a Thursday evening at my house. Diane had arranged it casually a few weeks out, over dinner one night. She said his name was Greg. Very personable, she thought I'd like him. I said that sounded fine. The attorney's advice for that meeting was simple: don't sign anything, ask clarifying questions, and make sure my phone was recording. What actually happened was different, because 2 days before the Thursday meeting, Marcus called me directly for the first time. He said he'd heard from his mom that the financial planning meeting was coming up, and he just wanted to personally reach out because, and he was very smooth here, he knew how protective I was of Renee and Sophie's future, and he wanted to make sure I understood that Greg's recommendations would absolutely take their interests into account. He was giving me an opening to bring up my daughter, to open the door to a conversation about my will. I said, I appreciate that, Marcus. I'll look forward to Thursday, he said. Well, I just want you to know, my mom is really happy, and you deserve to be happy too. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a while. Thursday came. Greg arrived at 6:30, khakis, blue blazer, very firm handshake, the kind of guy who makes immediate eye contact to signal trustworthiness. Diane made coffee. We sat at my dining room table, which Carol and I had bought at an estate sale in 1994, and Greg opened a folder. He had a presentation, printed pages, very professional looking, with my name at the top, which meant Diane had given him information about me ahead of time. He talked about optimizing fixed income positions and estate efficiency and relationship adjusted beneficiary structures, which is not a standard financial term and which I later confirmed means nothing official. He was describing in elaborate language a way to restructure my accounts that would have added Diane as a joint beneficiary and created a pathway for Marcus's firm to manage the investment portfolio on a commission basis. I listened to the whole presentation. I asked 2 questions, one about the fees structure, he got slightly vague, and one about fiduciary duty. He said he operated in my best interest without using the word fiduciary, which is a specific legal distinction that he clearly hoped I wouldn't notice. Then I said, I'll need to have my attorney review this before I commit to anything. The room changed. It was subtle. Diane's posture, Marcus's expression. Though Marcus wasn't there in person, I could feel his presence in the way Greg's smile tightened at the corners. Greg said, of course, absolutely, he'd send over all the documentation. He never sent the documentation. Diane became noticeably cooler over the following 2 weeks. She was still present, still attentive, but there was something effortful about it now, like a car running on the last quarter tank. She mentioned Greg once more, casually, and I said I was still waiting to hear back from my attorney, which I delivered with such comfortable blandness that she had nothing to push against. The AG's office made contact with Marcus in April. I was not involved in that process directly, and I don't know the full outcome, but Renee's attorney told me that the file on Marcus's operation had been formally opened and that 2 other families had come forward with similar accounts. That's not justice delivered on a Tuesday. It's slow and the legal system works at its own pace, but it's real. Diane stopped coming by in May. She sent a text, a long one, about how she'd realized that we were at different places in our lives, and she hoped I'd find what I was looking for. I read it once and didn't respond. There wasn't anything to say. I want to be honest about the afterward because I think people expect a certain kind of ending to a story like this, and the truth is messier. I was embarrassed for longer than I wanted to be. Not in public. I don't wear things on my face if I can help it, but privately, in the early morning before I got out of bed, I'd lie there and cycle through the small moments I'd missed. The way Marcus looked around my living room that third visit, the cardigan left on my couch, Diane asking about my will with that careful concern in her voice. I'd missed all of it, and I didn't like knowing that about myself. But I also kept coming back to my granddaughter standing in that hallway, holding a birthday card, choosing not to run to me with half a story, choosing instead to be patient and thorough and smart. She had trusted me to handle the truth when she was ready to give it to me, and that trust, that she thought I was strong enough to hear it, meant more to me than anything else. Sophie graduated from ASU in May. Her senior show was mixed media. She works with photography and layered text, and one of the pieces, which she did not explain to me in advance, was a large print of two sets of hands across a table, an old pair and a young pair, nearly touching. She called it the steady ones. I cried. I'm not ashamed of that either. I still go to the diner on Saturday mornings. Earl still starts my eggs before I sit down. I've been spending more time with Renee and her husband on weekends, and Sophie comes on Sundays to raid my refrigerator the same as she always did. Except now sometimes we sit on the back patio afterward and she talks about her work, and I talk about nothing much, and it's exactly as good as it sounds. I am not a dramatic man. I didn't set a trap or orchestrate a confrontation or expose anyone at a dinner table. What I did in the end was listen to the people who loved me, protect what Carol and I built, and decide that my dignity was not something anyone else got to price. I wasn't the one who'd been fooled. Not really. Not in the way that counted. I was the one with the right people in my corner. And in 67 years of living, I have found that that is the only thing that ever actually matters. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, turning it over the way you turn over a rock to see what's underneath. Not because I enjoy it. I don't. But because I think there's something in it worth understanding, and I'm not willing to just file it away and move on like it didn't happen. Here's what I keep coming back to. Marcus and Diane didn't target me randomly. They targeted me specifically. They looked at a 67-year-old widower with a paid-off house and a quiet life, and they made a calculation. They decided that a man like me, agreeable, steady, not the type to make a scene, was someone they could work around. And the honest thing I have to say is that they weren't entirely wrong about the raw material. I am agreeable. I don't make scenes. I give people the benefit of the doubt longer than I probably should. What they miscalculated was everything else. They didn't account for Sophie standing still in a hallway, listening, making a decision in real time about what to do with what she'd heard. They didn't account for Renee, who called an attorney before she called me, because she was thinking clearly when I couldn't. They didn't account for the fact that the people who loved me were paying attention even when I wasn't. That's the thing about actions. They don't just affect the person you're aiming at. They ripple. Marcus made a choice to exploit a grieving man for money, and that choice set off a chain of events he never modeled in any of his calculations. A granddaughter who recorded a conversation, a daughter who hired an attorney, a file that eventually landed on a desk at the Arizona AG's office. He thought he was being clever. He was actually building his own case against himself, one interaction at a time. I think about integrity a lot differently now than I did before this happened. I used to think of it as something you maintain for your own sake. A private standard, like keeping the garage organized or paying bills on time. What I understand now is that integrity is also structural. It's what holds things up when pressure is applied. The reason Sophie trusted me enough to tell me the truth, the whole truth without softening it, was because she knew I could handle it. She'd watched me handle hard things before. She knew what I was made of, even when I'd temporarily forgotten. That knowledge came from somewhere. It came from 38 years of watching how I treated her grandmother. It came from showing up to Little League games when I was tired. It came from the thousand small moments when I could have taken the easy way and didn't. None of that felt significant at the time. All of it mattered in the end. The world does not always deliver consequences on a schedule you can see. Marcus may face a long process. Diane has moved on to whatever she's moved on to. I don't spend time wishing something dramatic on either of them. What I know is that they are carrying what they did, and that is its own weight. I've watched enough life to know that people who build their comfort on other people's trust don't tend to build anything that lasts. What lasts is what Sophie made. A piece of art about two sets of hands nearly touching across a table. The steady ones. I wasn't the victim here. I was the man with the right people in his corner. And I was right because I'd earned that. Over a long time, by being someone worth standing next to. That's the only inheritance that can't be taken from you.